The sun had just begun to lift itself over the edge of the Wyoming hills, dragging a thin ribbon of light across the morning mist, when a scream tore through the stillness, raw and sharp like a wounded animal from the wild. Jake Callahan froze mid-movement, one foot in the stirrup, the other still touching the ground. He looked up, breath caught in his chest. That scream wasn't a coyote, wasn't a horse. It was human, full of pain, full of panic, full of abandonment. A man long accustomed to silence and cold, Jake still couldn't ignore a sound like that. He let the saddle fall hard onto the packed earth, grabbed his Winchester from the barn wall, and strode toward the fence line. His heavy boots crunched on dry gravel and dirt, breaking the hush of dawn. No wolves. No bears. The horses in the field only raised their heads calm. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Then he saw her. A girl barely 18 was tied to his fence like discarded cloth. Her dark hair clung to her cheeks, frozen from the cold. Lips cracked. A torn shawl flapped weakly over her shoulders like a flag of surrender. The rope bit deep into her wrists, her ankles bruised, and twisted, her body curled in on itself, trembling from cold and fear. Jake stopped. His heart slowed to a single heavy beat. "Don't touch me," she screamed as he stepped closer, her voice splintering like shattered glass. It was the voice of someone betrayed too many times, of a wild thing hunted too long, ready to bite. Jake raised both hands, his rifle slung across his back, voice low and steady, like the mountain rock. "I'm not going to hurt you, I swear." There was something in his tone, not pity, not authority, but something closer to remorse. She didn't speak again, just stared wide-eyed, waiting for the pain she'd come to expect. But it didn't come. He slowly reached for the small knife at his belt, moving with care as he cut through the bloodied ropes. She didn't pull away, didn't resist, but never stopped watching him, as if trying to decide whether he was real or just another ghost conjured by the cold. When the final knot fell free, her legs gave out. Jake caught her, not fully, just enough to keep her from hitting the ground. He didn't lift her up, didn't carry her inside. Instead, he took off his flannel shirt, folded it neatly, and placed it beneath her head. Then, quietly, he pulled the old silver locket from around his neck, engraved with the word "Mother," and set it in her frozen palm, not out of pity, but out of memory. "My father left me here," she whispered, her voice dry as desert wind. "Said I was done, like a horse with a broken leg." Jake clenched his jaw and looked past her toward the road. No wagon tracks, no sound but the wind. He nodded, eyes steady on hers. "You're not livestock," he said. "Not while I'm breathing." Then he turned, walked to the barn, and came back with a blanket and a canteen. She took a sip, hands trembling, eyes still fixed on him like she wasn't sure if he was real. Jake didn't ask her name, didn't press her for words. He knelt down once more, gently wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, and said, soft as a promise, "Rest here for now. We'll figure the rest out later." The mist still hung heavy in the air. The cold still bit through the bones. But something had shifted, not just in the wind, but in the space between two people. A solitary man, a discarded girl, and a morning no longer just part of another day, but the start of something neither of them yet had words for. Jake carried her into the cabin just as the sun climbed higher over the hills. She was weightless, like a shadow, not just because her frame was thin, but because something inside her had shattered so deeply that she no longer felt the heaviness of being alive. He didn't speak, just nudged the door open with the heel of his boot gently, as if afraid of waking something sacred that had slept too long inside this house. The cabin was small. One room, a stove, a bed. But it was clean. A fire burned low in the hearth. A wooden chair sat by the window. Jake set her down in that chair, wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders, and stepped back without saying another word. And in that moment she understood something he wasn't waiting for thanks. He only needed her to stay. Jake moved in the kitchen like a man who'd cooked 1,000 times, but never for anyone else. The soup was simple marrow bones, dried onions, carrots, a half loaf of stale bread sliced beside a tin bowl. He didn't look at her while he cooked. only paused now and then, tilting his head to listen to the fire crackling behind him, like checking if the warmth had truly taken root. Emma, though her name hadn't yet been spoken, curled up in the chair, the blanket clutched tight around her small hands. Her eyes scanned the room, not out of curiosity, but reflex. She was still scared, but not of Jake. Just too used to being scared, period. The bare wood walls, the rifle mounted above the fireplace, the pale light filtering through the window onto her colorless face. She wasn't sure if she was still a person, or just the remnants of what people used to call a girl. When Jake brought her the bowl of soup, he didn't push it on her, just placed it gently within reach, then backed away and sat by the window. But she smelled it, the sweet tang of onion, the richness of slow-cooked bone, the earthy warmth of carrot and charred wood. And something else, something faint, something like home. She picked up the spoon. Her hand trembled. She didn't eat right away, just sniffed careful like an animal that had been beaten before, and now suspected poison in every gift. Jake noticed, but said nothing, turned his face toward the window and gave her space. The clink of the spoon against tin rang out soft, uncertain, then silence, then again a quiet clink. When he glanced back, the bowl was half empty. She was still trembling, but no longer scanning the room for exits. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice rough like wind slipping through the cracks in the wall. Jake didn't answer right away. He walked to the fireplace and pulled an old leather book from behind the logs. He opened it, flipped to the middle, and pulled something out, a small pressed flower. Purple aster, fragile and silent, like memory. "My mother gave me this," he said. "The last day I ever saw her. She told me when the world turns cruel, look at it. Remember that even trampled things still bloom." Emma stared at the flower in his hand, withered, nearly crumbling, and her eyes misted not from smoke. Jake continued, voice slower now. "I don't have much left. No wife. No kids. No one but this land and this house. But when I saw you tied to that fence this morning..." I remembered the flower. She didn't reply, but her gaze stopped darting. And for that moment, no one was rescuing anyone. They were just sitting there. Two broken souls, looking at each other through the same shard of glass. Jake's voice softened. "You don't owe me anything. Not trust, not gratitude, just rest. The rest, we'll figure out later." Outside, the sky remained heavy with morning mist, the air still sharp with leftover winter. But the fire inside the cabin burned warmer now, and the girl, still unnamed, sat in that chair, her hand wrapped tightly around the locket he'd given her the day before. Somewhere deep in the bloodied corners of her heart, something small and long forgotten had begun to thaw. 3 days had passed since Jake cut her free from the fence. Emma still hadn't stepped outside. Each morning she sat by the window, watching sunlight sweep across the rooftop, listening to horses whinnying in the pasture, and the smell of hot soup drifting from the stove. Jake never forced her to talk, never asked about her past. He just cooked chopped wood, sharpened his axe on the porch, and each night quietly added one more log to the fire, before retreating into the shadows. But Emma heard everything, not from inside the house, but from outside. The whispers, the sound of horses stopping at the gate, figures standing just beyond the fence line watching for a moment before leaving, the unnatural silence of a town too small to keep secrets. Rumors moved faster than wind across the valley. Jake Callahan, the man who barely spoke to anyone but his horses, had brought home a young girl. A girl who'd been thrown away. A girl no one bothered to keep. They didn't know her name, but they knew she was Earl Turner's daughter, and that was enough to judge her. Emma felt those words like needles beneath her skin. No one had to say them to her face. She heard them in the silence when Jake returned from town, his saddle heavier, his eyes a little darker, though his mouth stayed quiet. That morning, Emma stood at the door. She wore one of Jake's old shirts, sleeves rolled up the waist, cinched with twine. Her hair, no longer matted to her cheeks, had been brushed and tied back. Her boots were clean, her eyes looked forward, but her hands twisted nervously beneath the hem of the shirt. "I want to go with you into town," she said. Jake looked up from the saddle he was mending, studied her for a long moment. Not out of doubt, but thought. "You sure?" She nodded. "I'm tired of hiding." Jake didn't smile. He just reached for the wide-brimmed hat hanging on the wall, dusted it off, and gently placed it on her head. "All right then, let's go." They rode side by side into town. The sound of hooves clattered on packed earth, but the loudest thing was the silence. Storefronts darkened. The blacksmith froze, mid-swing hammer suspended in the air. A mother yanked her child from the water trough, not out of thirst, but fear. Emma felt their eyes. None of them looked directly at her, but all of them landed like sharp stones on her back. When they reached the general store, Emma climbed the wooden steps. Halfway up, sharp footsteps behind her made her freeze. "Well, I'll be damned," came a shrill voice. Mrs. Ellery, an old widow with eyes like blades and a cane harder than the town's mercy, stepped out from the side. Her lips were tight, as if they held in a lifetime's worth of bitterness, just waiting to spit. "So you're dragging your trash into town now, are you?" Jake Callahan, Jake stepped up beside Emma, placing himself slightly between them, his back as straight as an old oak tree. "We're not here for trouble," he said. "Too late," she snapped. "That girl belongs in a cell, not playing house with a lonely man trying to make peace with his guilt." Emma didn't speak, didn't flinch, but her lips went pale. And then came the final blow. Mrs. Ellery bent down, scooped a handful of dry dirt from the road, and hurled it at her boot. Filth, she spat the word cold and hard as dried blood. Jake didn't yell, didn't reach for his gun. He simply turned, placed a steady hand on Emma's shoulder, and squeezed gently. "Let's go," he said. They turned and walked back down the steps. Emma held her head high. She didn't look at the widow, didn't look at anyone. But the whispers rose behind her like venom riding the wind. Back at the cabin, Jake dismounted and walked straight to the barn. Emma stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The room darkened not from the sunset, but like a place that had just borne witness to a shame that didn't belong to it. She crossed the floor, opened the drawer. Inside was a small cracked mirror, dusty with a chip in one corner. She lifted it, looked in. The girl in the reflection had changed, still not free, but not the frightened creature anymore either. Just someone trying to recognize herself after all the noise. The mirror slipped from her hands, landing face down on the floor. It didn't break. She collapsed beside it, knees drawn up, and let the tears come like a storm long overdue. Outside, the wind moved gently through the prairie grass, but inside a girl had just taken her first step past fear. And somewhere out by the barn, Jake, still silent, stood tall. A quiet anchor, the unmoving center of a trust still being born. The rain from the night before hadn't yet dried on the ground when the sound of horse hooves echoed from the far edge of the ranch. It wasn't the slow trot of the postman or the casual ride of an old neighbor bringing bread. This was something else, heavy, deliberate, full of intent, like a knock on the door with a drawn blade. Jake stood still beside the fence he'd been mending hammer in hand, but he didn't drive another nail. His eyes fixed on the ridge where red dust began to rise in a long streak like smoke. 3 riders were approaching, 1 familiar, 2 strangers. The man in front swayed in the saddle, a bottle in one hand, hat tilted, beard ragged. He rode like his character, loose, mean, and falling apart. Jake recognized him immediately. Earl Turner, Emma's father. The 2 men behind didn't need names. One had a long scar across his cheek. The other had dull, drifting eyes, like he'd just woken from a fight that never ended. They weren't family. They weren't friends. They were paid. Hired threats with no cause but coin. Jake let the hammer fall to the dirt, wiped his hands on an old rag, and stepped out from under the trees. No greeting. No nod. Just stood there, spine straight as a fence post. Earl lifted the bottle like a toast between old acquaintances. Jake Callahan, the righteous cowpoke turned babysitter, he didn't flinch. "What do you want, Earl?" The two goons spread out not by much, but enough to suggest a loose half-circle, not openly hostile, but ready. Jake didn't reach for his gun. Not yet. I came to collect what's mine. Earl slurred thick with whiskey and arrogance. That girl, my blood. I sired her. She belongs to me. Jake didn't budge. She stopped being yours the day you tied her to a fence like dead stock. Earl let out a laugh, brittle and broken like rocks rattling in an empty bucket. She ain't never been worth a damn. Born a curse, a walk in debt and a dress. I just want the tumor cut clean out of my life. Jake's eyes darkened. Not from surprise, he knew the type. Men who treated life like a ledger and people like things. But his voice stayed calm. I don't raise what other men throw away. I protect what deserves a second chance. Earl stepped closer, pulling aside his coat. His hand hovered near the gun beneath. His voice lowered into a growl. I made her. I have the right to end her. That's between me and God. Jake didn't back down. His words came slow-heavy as lead dropped into a well. She doesn't belong to you. She never did. The wind swept across the field, tossing a few strands of Jake's hair and pulling dust into the air between them, between fury and resolve. Jake tilted his head toward the old oak tree near the porch. If you think you've still got the right, then step through that gate. I'll bury you right there under the shade of that tree. No yelling, no grand threats, but the scarred man shifted uneasily. The other one took a small step back. Earl stood frozen. The whiskey in him evaporated under the weight of what he saw Jake wasn't bluffing. Earl's eyes flicked toward the cabin window, where behind the curtain a small silhouette Emma watched with one hand pressed to the frame, like she feared the door itself might burst open from his words. Jake took one step forward. Earl took two back. I don't want her, he roared, desperation cracking through his voice. I just want you to know she ain't worth it. Callahan, Jake said nothing. He didn't need to. In his eyes, worth wasn't in blood. It was in who stayed standing after everything. Earl climbed back onto his horse like a man who'd just lost the last lie he told himself. The three of them turned their mounts. None looked back. When the dust finally settled, Jake was still standing unscathed, but his heart thumped like a winter drum. Not because he feared Earl, but because he knew this was only the beginning. The storm hadn't truly arrived yet. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Emma stepped out, her face pale but dry. Aren't you afraid? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Jake turned to her. His eyes were steady. His hand reached up, brushing the dust gently from her hair. No, he said. I'm only afraid that one day you'll stop believing you deserve to live. The wind shifted before the light fully broke. A different scent swept across the prairie. Not dew or horse manure, but rusted iron. The scent of steel-toed power and debts left unpaid. Jake felt it in his bones before he heard the hoofbeats. 5 riders appeared at the edge of the property. Long coats, hats pulled low. Their coats were a faded red, like dried blood. Jake didn't need a closer look. Marcus Devlin had arrived. Jake didn't wait for them to knock. He turned back into the cabin, voice low but firm. Emma, it's time. No questions needed. Emma was already standing by the door, satchel packed, water, ammunition, her Colt revolver, and the silver locket Jake had once placed in her hand that early morning. No words wasted. Jake slid the table across the doorway, locked the windows, then led her out the back like 2 forest birds slipping from the nest before the hawk struck. In the horse barn, Jake helped her climb to the upper loft. He handed her the Winchester, the one that had belonged to his mother. 2 rounds at a time, he said. Don't aim for the chest. Shoot the legs. Slow them down. She swallowed hard. I've never. You'll know when, he replied, touching her shoulder. Not goodbye, but belief. Then he disappeared into the shadows below. The first shot wasn't aimed to kill. It was a message from Devlin. A warning. But Jake knew better. Men like Devlin didn't parley. They conquered. If Emma was taken, they'd burn the land just to prove they could. Jake took position behind a haystack gun resting on the beam, eyes fixed and unblinking. First shot left flank. One man down, clutching his knee, screaming. Second-shot rifleman spun and dropped. The remaining two scattered hesitant, but one rushed the barn. He kicked the door open, stormed in, gun sweeping wide. Jake didn't fire. He waited. Then from behind the hay, Jake leapt. The two crashed onto the dusty floor, fists, knees, elbows, breath and blood, and the scrape of boots. The man was strong, knife in hand. One slash tore across Jake's arm, blood sprayed like ink from a shattered jar. But Jake didn't fall back. He gripped the man's wrist, twisted. Then a gunshot from above. The man collapsed, head tilted, eyes wide open, knife still clenched in hand. Jake looked up. Emma stood above, rifle trembling in her grip like a leaf in a high wind. She stared at him, not crying, but her eyes asked only one thing. Did I kill him? Jake didn't speak. He just nodded. She nodded back. For the first time, not as someone broken, but as someone who had chosen to live. Outside, the others fled, but Marcus Devlin remained. Black horse, silver saddle. He didn't draw, didn't shout, just stared at the barn like a man who thought he could buy the soul inside. Jake stepped out, shirt soaked in blood, limping, but eyes steady. Devlin dismounted. Between them stretched an open space and a quiet understanding between two very different breeds of men. She belongs to me, Devlin said. Contract, signature, collateral, a debt unpaid. Jake shook his head. People aren't property. Devlin's lip curled. When I buy something, I take it. Jake didn't raise his voice. Send the bill. But if you or your men take one more step onto this land, I'll settle it 6 feet under that old oak. Devlin stared long. He knew. Jake wasn't bluffing. She worth dying for, Devlin asked, as if he couldn't grasp the answer. Jake didn't hesitate. She's worth living for. Minutes passed. Wind moved through the trees. Devlin climbed back on his horse. This ain't over, he shouted loud enough for Emma to hear. She's mine, and one day I'll come collect. Then he turned and rode off. The dust he kicked up couldn't cover the weight of his defeat. Jake stood bloodied and silent. Emma stepped from the barn gun still in hand, lips dry, eyes wide. I didn't mean to kill, she said. Jake walked to her, rested his hand on her shoulder. You didn't kill, he said. You chose to live. And then it rained, soft, gentle, as if even the sky knew. Some things needed washing away. And not just the blood. The wooden chair sat in its usual spot on the porch every morning, leaned back against the cabin wall, catching the first light of day and the long shadows of dusk. Emma often sat there before the sun had fully warmed the ground, her hands wrapped around a mug of peppermint tea Jake had brewed, her eyes tracing the distant tree line that stretched into the fields. The back of the chair curved just enough to cradle her slender spine. The armrests were smooth, worn down by hands that had passed over them too many times to count. Every time she sat down, her fingers would find the small carving without thinking EM not large, not flashy, just deep enough to never fade. Jake had never said why he carved it. But he didn't need to. Emma knew. Anyone would. A chair was an invitation to stay. A quiet admission. You have a place here, not because you need one, but because I want you to have it. That day, spring was coming to a close. The wind carried the scent of damp earth mixed with the wildflowers Emma had planted along the edge of the yard. Jake was repairing the old fence, the hammer in his hand, beating out a steady rhythm against the wooden posts. Sweat darkened the back of his shirt in slow widening patches. Emma stood a little ways off, watching the line of his back, strong, steady. For the first time in her life, she looked at a man without fear, and with something close to peace. She walked toward him. No build-up, no lead-in. Her voice was soft, but steady. What if... I wanted to change my last name. Jake froze. The hammer stopped mid-swing. He didn't turn right away, just stood still for a moment, then spoke, voice low and grounded like the Wyoming soil. Then I'll take yours. Emma blinked. What he said wasn't a proposal. but it was the closest thing to a promise she had ever heard. Not marry me, but if you choose, I choose with you. She laughed. A real laugh, light and clear like a spoon clinking against a tin bowl at breakfast. The sound scattered a flock of birds off the roof and lit up the sunlight in her eyes. Jake turned, squinting at her, puzzled. What nothing? She smiled, shaking her head. It's just, no one's ever asked if I wanted someone to carry my name. Jake didn't smile, but the tips of his ears flushed red. He looked down and went back to his work, driving in the post. His hands moved the same, but his breath. It was different now. That night, like every night they sat on the porch. Jake whittled a piece of wood with his pocket knife. Emma curled into her chair, a wool blanket wrapped around her legs, her hands cupped around a warm mug. They didn't say much. Let the silence fill the space between them, wide and steady, like the starlit sky above. Something had shifted, not because of the question, but because of the answer offered without demand, without terms. Just readiness. Emma glanced over. He was still focused on carving the shavings, collecting at his boots like layers of an old shell, shedding away from a man who had lived too long in silence. She didn't need a ring, didn't need a white dress. But she still asked quietly, as if afraid the wind might carry the words away. Do you think love can come after you already know someone? Jake didn't answer right away. He paused, set the knife down on the porch floor. Then he turned, looked straight at her. No hesitation, no retreat. I don't know if I've ever been in love. But I know the day you walked out of that house, gun in hand, choosing to fight for yourself. That's the day I knew I wanted to live beside you. No poetry, no declarations. But the way he said it made Emma drop her eyes, her lips trembling, just a little. No one knelt. No one offered a silver ring. But under the soft glow of the porch lantern, their hands found each other for the first time, not from fear, not from need, but from choice. And in the warmth of the palm wrapped around hers, Emma heard her own heartbeat steady as hoofbeats on solid ground, peaceful, not because she had been saved, but because someone had chosen to ride alongside her. That morning looked like any other, if you were only looking with your eyes. The sky was pale gray, the wind drifted softly across the fields, and the rooster crowed from the back coop, just like always. But in the ground, in the air, in the hearts of those watching, something was shifting. Emma stood in front of the mirror, wearing the white dress she had sewn herself. No lace, no silk, just soft cotton washed 100 times. Her hair was loosely braided, tucked with wildflowers picked from the back garden. She was barefoot, not because she was poor, but because she chose to be. So she could feel every grain of earth beneath her feet, the same earth where she had once fallen, and now would rise a woman in her own right. Outside beneath the old oak tree, the same one where Jake once vowed to bury anyone who dared treat her like property, the townsfolk gathered quietly. Not a crowd, just enough. The sheriff wiped his glasses and stood at attention. The cafe lady brought a berry tart. A young girl handed Emma a bouquet of wildflowers. As she stepped out of the cabin, no one gave her away. Because she belonged to no one but herself. Jake stood under the tree wearing a freshly washed white shirt hat in hand. His eyes weren't glowing. But when he saw Emma walking toward him, each step steady and sure, he smiled. A small smile tilted just for her, as if the whole world now held only two people. There was no long sermon, no minister's speech, just two people locking eyes. A ring hand-forged from a horseshoe by Jake himself. He slid it onto her finger, his hands rough and honest like western soil, and said quietly, "No one's giving you to me. You came on your own, and I chose you too." Emma didn't cry. She just nodded. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of fresh grass and something that felt like forgiveness. Applause rose from the small crowd, not loud but real. They didn't come for curiosity. They came for respect. Because they knew some people walk through hell and still plant flowers. That evening, they sat on the porch. She in the carved wooden chair bearing her initials, he beside her hand in hers. No need for words. But in their quiet gaze was something loud, and true life doesn't have to be perfect. It just needs two people choosing each other every day. And in the soft fire crackling inside the silver locket, now resting against Emma's chest, sparkled not for its worth, but for the story it carried a gift from the past, now a promise for a future chosen freely. If you've made it this far, maybe your heart's gone still quiet as the Wyoming wind at dusk, because you understand this isn't just a love story. It's a story of being chosen, of standing back up, of refusing to be defined by old pain. Emma is not the girl who was saved. She's the woman who chose to live, to stand, to trust again. And Jake, who never had much to say about love, learned to speak it in every action. A pair of boots dried by the door, a teapot mended a chair carved with care. Out here in the American West, love doesn't have to shout. It just has to stay. We should stand behind them, not just because they deserve it, but because they remind us of the kind of people this world needs more than ever, those who've broken, but didn't shatter, who've been abandoned, but still choose to be a shelter for someone else. If you're hearing this story from a distant ranch, a desert cafe, or a room at the end of some long hallway in a quiet town, remember true love doesn't come to rescue. It comes to walk beside you. And if you believe in that, then support them. With your heart. Send a message. Share the story. Tell someone who's barely hanging on that Emma exists. Jake exists, and so does Dawn after the storm. As for Emma and Jake, maybe they're not thinking about tomorrow yet. But I'll leave them with one suggestion. Plant a tree. Right by the porch. Maybe an apple, or a willow. Something that lives long. Something that blooms, then bears fruit. Because there's no better way to tell the world, we were here. And we truly lived.